Truth Transistors. This is a Bible study series where we will look at the big picture of the message of the Bible. Today I want to talk about the prophecies in Daniel, but first I want to give some examples of how I think prophecy oftentimes is done. In Genesis 37, 5 through 7, and as well as verse 9, Joseph has a dream that a bunch of sheaves, and his sheaf stands upright, and his brother's sheaves all bound down to his sheaf. And then in verse 9, the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed down to him. And he told it to his father and to his brethren, and his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and my mother and the brethren indeed come to bow down ourselves to thee on the earth? So obviously there is a direct fulfillment with his 11 brothers and his mother and father, which I think in this case it's not his direct mother. I think it was his one of his father's other wives. So there's the obvious fulfillment that is meant for that generation at that time. However, there is also, you could look at it, Joseph being an ancestor of Christ, and throughout Jewish history, throughout the Old Testament, there were those that were part of the lineage of Jesus, leading up to Jesus. And Jesus had 11 disciples, or 12 disciples, sorry. So there's also this idea that Joseph being a type of Christ, that the disciples would bow down to him, and even at the very end, 144,000, which is a multiple of 12. Although I just noted that this dream is not 12, it's 11, because it's his 11 brothers. And one of his brothers, or actually most of his brothers, were guilty of this, so it's a little different, but one of his brothers had the idea of selling him, or actually killing him, but then they decided not to kill him, but throw him in a pit and then sell him as a slave. So he was in a pit for 3 days and 3 nights. And then one of the 12 disciples, which was Judas, betrayed Jesus and turned him into Rome. And Jesus was on the cross and died and was in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights. So there's some more similarities there. I think, the obvious fulfillment is what is directly being portrayed with his brothers. But I think there is, a type of Christ in that dream, as well as in the life of Joseph. But there's also enough differences to show that it's not a copy of the same story, like some skeptics might assume. I also want to point out, I've recently been reading Isaiah and Jeremiah, and these are very difficult books because they kind of jump all over the place in terms of oftentimes it's speaking of Israel at that time, being in captivity or going into captivity with Babylon. But also it talks about the first coming of Jesus. It talks about the second coming of Jesus. Sometimes it talks about Israel being gathered together, or the restoration of Israel. Sometimes it talks about Israel being rebuked. So it's very confusing. It's very all over the place. So as far as I could tell from reading through them, and it would take further study on my part, but it seems like I saw things from from different points of history all being prophesied at the same time, while directly being applicable to Israel in that day. So I wanted to say all that to say that prophecy oftentimes has a direct fulfillment that's applicable to that day, and talking about things going on, but also has ultimate fulfillments later on. So now in the book of Daniel, I'm going to start with the prophecy, the dream of Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2 of Daniel, starting in verse 31. Now, just to give a little context, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream that disturbed him, but he didn't remember what the dream was. He asked his wise men, and they were like, saying, how can we interpret a dream if you don't tell us what the dream is? Well, God revealed the dream to Daniel, and now Daniel is going to tell him the dream and the fulfillment of it. I'm just going to give you the summary of it here. The head of gold, and then it had a breast and arms of silver, the belly and thighs of brass, the legs of iron, and the feet of iron and clay, and toes. There were, obviously there's 10 toes on feet. So, and then the stone breaks the feet in pieces. Then the rest of the statue breaks. The stone became a mountain and filled the earth. Now, in Daniel 2:36 starts the meaning of the dream. The head of gold is Nebuchadnezzar, and I would say, or Babylon, because Nebuchadnezzar was not the last king of Babylon. The breast of arms and silver was another kingdom after, which was inferior. And so that's why I think the head of gold is actually Babylon, and even though he says Nebuchadnezzar, so there's kind of a dual meaning there as well. I guess Nebuchadnezzar being the king at that time represents Babylon. But anyway, the belly and the thighs of brass was the third kingdom that shall rule all the earth, the legs of iron, the fourth kingdom, and then the feet of iron and clay, mixed with clay. The fourth kingdom is divided. Then the toes, kings and last days. Then the stone that breaks the feet in pieces, the kingdom of God is the stone. And the rest of the statue breaks, shall destroy world kingdoms, and then it shall take the whole earth, as the stone became a mountain and filled the earth. So it's talking about consecutive kingdoms that are coming. And this is a fascinating book. There's a lot of skeptics trying to prove that Daniel was written much later because of these direct connections. On the one hand, it's easy to say, well, there's going to be a kingdom after this, and then a kingdom after that, and a kingdom after that. I mean, anybody can predict that. But to say, to specifically connect the fourth kingdom with iron, which Rome was known, as the Iron Age kingdom, and then Rome split, whereas iron and clay, the fourth kingdom is divided. So there are some very specific things going on here. And Rome was the fourth kingdom after Babylon. So you have Babylon, then you had the Medes and the Persians, and then you had the Greece, and then you had Rome, which was later divided. Now, there's a lot of there's a lot of preterists, or what you'd call post-millennial returns of Christ, that believes that the stone broken pieces, the kingdom started of Jesus started at his resurrection, which is true. But they would say that the 10 toes was back at 70 AD, or what have you, the Roman emperors back in that early church days. But I want to point out that the iron and clay is divided. The kingdom is divided before you get to the 10 toes. So I would be interested in hearing their explanation of that. I don't want to be unfair to anybody, but I'm just telling you what I have a hard time grasping, and that would be one of them. But and also, it's hard to look at the world today and say that the kingdom of God has the power on the earth. Now, God's kingdom is thriving, and the gospel is spreading all over the world. But is it really, controlling the kings? Has it really broken into pieces the kingdoms of this world yet? And I would say no. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that. So that's the first dream in Daniel. Oh, real quickly, I forgot to say, as I was saying, a lot of skeptics want to suggest that this was written much later because of the prophecies that are so clear. Daniel is found clearly in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and so there's a lot of evidence. And there's a video by Mike Winger that I have under the playlist called Evidence of the Bible, or Historical Evidence of the Bible, and I think I posted one of Mike Winger talking about Daniel, and he does a really good job showing evidence that Daniel was written back when it's claimed to be around 400, 500 BC, before Christ. So that's kind of interesting to note. Now, the next dream I wasn't going to do until I read it. The tree, chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar has another dream, and there's a tree that's on the earth. This is the dream Nebuchadnezzar had, and it grows to the heavens. And then a holy one cried out to cut it down. The stumps and roots are left in its place with a band of iron and brass. And that phrase right there makes me want to include this, even though I'm making a speculation here, but hear me out. Then it says, the tree shall lose its leaves and become as from man to the beast in the field, to know the Most High is God. This king will be humbled and know that God is God. And then the fulfillment is that the tree is Nebuchadnezzar. It grew in power and fruit. So, grew into the heavens. It grew in power and fruit, fruitfulness into the, is the most powerful kingdom. And then the king shall be driven out, his influence in future kingdoms. And it talks about, Nebuchadnezzar really, literally, this is definitely talking about Nebuchadnezzar, because he became a wild beast, lived among the wild beasts. I don't know if that means he was insane, or if he just got rejected and he was homeless basically and lived out among, the animals, or what. But it humbled him to the point where he acknowledged God as Lord. And so I wanted to point this out because while the most obvious is the fulfillment of Nebuchadnezzar, and it's directly talking about him, the band of iron and brass stuck out to me. And it makes me wonder if the stump and its roots left in its place is referring to the iron and brass in the statue prophecy, which is the third kingdom and the fourth kingdom. The third kingdom being Greece, and the fourth kingdom being Rome. And so, when Babylon is cut off, now it doesn't mention the silver, which would be the Medes and the Persians. So I find that kind of interesting. And I don't know, maybe I'm making speculation there, but I think why would there be iron and brass on a stump and roots? That wouldn't make sense unless it's referring directly to something else. So I thought I would point that out. So could it be that Babylon itself, because the head of gold said it was Nebuchadnezzar, right? But I think it was also Babylon itself. So could this tree also be Babylon, not just Nebuchadnezzar, and Babylon is driven into desolation, so to speak? But the stump and the roots, which are following kingdoms, if iron and brass is Greece and Rome, then they still have the influence of this tree, and they're still carrying out this tree, which will eventually grow back. So Babylon itself, in the last days, there's Mystery Babylon. And so is it possible that Mystery Babylon is carried out through Greece and Rome? So anyway, I just thought that was interesting. Okay, so the next dream was dreamt by Daniel, and it's in chapter 7, starting in verse 3. And in this one, you have these four beasts. First was the lion with eagle's wings, which were plucked and made to stand on 2 feet, and a man's heart was given to it. Second, you had a bear raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in its mouth. They said, "Arise and devour much flesh." The third is the leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads. And the fourth is dreadful and terrible and exceedingly strong, with iron teeth. It devoured and brake into pieces, and stamped the residue with its feet, had 10 horns. A little horn came up and uprooted 3 of the first horns, with eyes like a man and a mouth speaking great things. When all were cast down, the Ancient of Days sat on the throne. Son of Man appeared in the clouds, and he was given power and glory of all peoples with an everlasting kingdom. Now, there's a few little phrases that stand out here, but let's look at the fulfillment here. Starting in verse 17, Daniel asks for a fulfillment, or what does these mean? And it says, the four kings that shall arise out of the earth. Now, I wanted to make this quick point. Most people assume that these four are the same four of the statue that Nebuchadnezzar dreamed. Now, there's some similarities here, but there's also some differences. It never says that. The statue, it specifically states, and there's a couple of other visions in here that I didn't get to. There's the ram, and it specifically says what the ram is that's going west. You can look at that one if you want. There's, and it specifically says what those are. But I wanted to point out that this says four kings that shall arise out of the earth. Now, is it possible? So there's another view that believes that these are four kings at the end of days, or even leading up to the end of days. But it also could be the four, it seems pretty logical to assume that it's the same as the four in the statue, because there's some similarities here. But this phrase, four kings that shall arise, suggests that they haven't gotten there yet. And there's probably a lot of similarities to the four kings, the four kingdoms in the statue. One of the similarities in the lion, it says a man's heart was given to it. And if you look at I didn't really get into details, but in the tree, it talks about a man's heart as well. So there's a similarity there. But I'm not sure what the eagle's wings would be. Maybe the lion with the eagle's wings. Maybe the lion is Babylon and the eagle's wings is Media Persia, because there's two of them. I don't know. That would probably be, if it was these four kings, then the bear rised up on one side and had 3 ribs in its mouth. They said, arise and devour much flesh. A lot of people would say that's Greece. So, in other words, in this vision, lion with eagle's wings is sort of combining Babylon with the Medes and Persians, or it's something completely different in the future, or something that's here today. But the bear rised up on one side and devoured much flesh. A lot of people would say when Alexander the Great devoured much land, that would be Greece. Then the leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads. Now, the thing is, though, that if the bear is Greece, it doesn't seem to make sense that the bear would be Medes and Persians, because it doesn't seem to indicate that. Then the leopard would be Rome, which doesn't make sense. It's a little weird, like the 4 wings and the 4 heads. How is that? So I'm a little confused on this. So that's why I think these are not the same as the 4 kings in the statue. But then in the 4th beast, it says it has iron teeth. And that iron, again, connects to the iron in the statue, which would be Rome. And then it has 10 horns, which the statue had 10 toes. But of course, the 10 toes were in the iron mingled with clay. And so, obviously, in the statue, the 10 toes is when when the kingdom is divided and the iron is mingled with clay. That's when the stone comes and destroys the whole statue. And so I do think there's a connection. The statue is sort of going from the time of Babylon to the very end. And this also ends, seems to end at the same. And it says the little horn came up and uprooted 3 of the first horns. So that's a detail that was not in the first, in the statue. With eyes like a man and a mouth speaking great things. And then when all were cast down, the Ancient of Days sat on the throne. Son of Man appeared in the clouds, and he was given power and glory of all peoples, an everlasting kingdom. Now, again, a preterist would believe, the postmillennial believes that this all took place at the resurrection of Jesus, and they have explanations for that. But when it goes down and says the Son of Man appeared in the clouds and he was given power and glory, when he appeared in the clouds, that seems to indicate the second coming. So what that means is, I think this is talking about a final kingdom. Now, in the fulfillment, starting in verse 17, it says the four kings that shall arise, and then the fourth kingdom is diverse from all kingdoms before, having 10 horns, which are 10 kings. Another king shall subdue, speaking against the saints and God, times, and half a time. Again, that would be, for a preterist, would be around 70 AD. There was 3.5 years that a king ruled that persecuted and the temple was destroyed. Or it could mean a future reference to the end times. Now, again, going back to the dream of Joseph, as I said before, these could have multiple meanings. They could have immediate meaning of that day that has a similar fulfillment with an ultimate fulfillment later. So I just wanted to point that out as well, that there's a lot of similarities here, but there's a lot of differences. And then it says, the saints would take the kingdom. All shall serve God. The saints have grown. The gospel has spread throughout the world, but we have not taken the kingdom on earth. That seems, for those that believe that we're in the millennium today, they say that it doesn't mean that we would have, maybe they believe that eventually we will have political power on earth before Christ returns. But, I think that's talking about the second coming of Christ, and that's when the saints would take the kingdom. But that's my understanding of it. And then it says, all shall serve God. And that's definitely not happening now. So finally, I want to talk about in Revelation chapter 12, starting in verse 3. I'm sorry, Revelation 13 and Revelation 13. Sorry. So both of those. And in Revelation 12:3, it says there's a dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, the beast in Daniel, it doesn't say it's a dragon. It just says it's a great beast, dreadful and terrible. And it does mention 10 horns. So I assume this is talking about the same beast. But again, like I said, there's parallels. And then in 13, starting in 1, it says, this beast with 7 heads and 10 horns was like a leopard, with feet of a bear, mouth of a lion, and the dragon gave his power. So notice this beast with 7 heads and 10 horns is like a leopard, which was one of the 4 beasts in Daniel, a feet of a bear, which was one of the 4 beasts in Daniel, and the mouth of a lion, which was also one of the 4 beasts. And the dragon gave his power. So could it be that the 4 beasts in Daniel are different, and then this is an ultimate final beast? Or is it the same as the 4th beast in Daniel? And the answer is, I don't know. But I'm just telling you these similarities here. And then in verse 5, it says, speaking great things and blasphemies, which is also mentioned with the 4th beast of the 11th horn in the final beast in Daniel. But this time it adds the word blasphemies, which in Daniel it didn't say. It just says speaking great things. And now it says great things and blasphemies. So it's making more of a clarity here. So the kingdoms of this world are controlled by the dragon, which is clarified to be Satan here in Revelation, who gives them their power. His system connects all kingdoms from Babylon to the end. And I would say Egypt would have been included, but the dreams in Daniel were given after Egypt was gone. And so I want to conclude this by stating that people argue over what is, if it's Rome or if it's a future kingdom or if it's this or that. But the thing that sticks out to me is that they're all connected. I think the dragon gives its power to all the kingdoms that have been on this earth. And As we get deeper into Mystery Babylon and what I believe Mystery Babylon is, there's a video that I've posted and a playlist I've made called Mystery Babylon Revealed. But find one of the videos on there, I think it's near the top of the playlist, is called William Cooper Mystery Babylon Essential Edit. His Mystery Babylon series is like 50 hours long, but I edited it down to 2 hours of what I think gives a full summary of it. The reason I think that's important to watch, and maybe I'll stick it in this playlist as well right after this video, because I think that the kingdom, the dragon, the kingdom of Satan is found in Mystery Babylon, which has been around, I believe, since Nimrod, if not going back before the flood. But this is an important thing to understand, and who is behind it all and how it all connects. And so, really, if you think about the statue, it's all connected. It's all one entity, but they're all connected. But one gives way to another, to another, to another. Yet it's all one big statue, and then the stone breaks all of it. When Jesus returns, I believe that's when the stone will break the kingdoms of this world, and it'll become the kingdoms of our God, and he shall reign forever and ever.